The night was quiet inside the little diner on the corner of Maple Street, and the neon sign buzzed outside against the dark sky. While inside, the lights glowed soft and yellow, and the smell of fried chicken and coffee filled the air. And it was close to closing time, and only a few people sat at the booths with some sipping coffee and others reading the paper, and the floor shined because it had just been cleaned. And the sound of plates clinking in the back echoed faintly. And at the counter stood a young waitress named Kiara Faith, who was 22 years old and tall and beautiful, with smooth brown skin that glowed under the diner lights. And her hair was tied back neatly, and her uniform was simple, but she wore it with Grace. And Kiara was the daughter of Nigerian parents who had come to America years ago chasing hope. And Kiara had grown up in the city working hard every day to help her family. And most people only saw a waitress when they looked at her. But behind her, smile was a secret, because Kiara had been trained in martial arts since she was a little girl, as her father had been a fighter back in Nigeria, and he had taught her discipline and respect, and told her that strength was not only in the body, but also in the heart. And she had trained in quiet parks at dawn and in old gyms at night. And she had mastered balance, speed, and power. But she never showed off and kept her gift hidden. And that night, her gift would be tested because the door to the diner opened with a sharp sound as cold air rushed in. And a man walked inside who was tall, broad, and carried himself like he owned the world, with arms thick with muscle and a chest that stretched the fabric of his shirt, and his face was rough with eyes that looked hard. And he scanned the diner like he was hunting something. And his name was Mark, and he was 35 years old and known in the neighborhood as a bully because people feared him for his size, and his love for picking fights in Kiara felt her chest tighten when she saw him, because she had seen men like him before, loud and cruel, and she hoped he would just eat and leave. But when she walked to the counter with a kind smile and asked softly what she could get him, he smirked and mocked her voice, saying, "Get me a coffee and hurry and do not waste my time, girl." And Kiara nodded and turned to pour the coffee, but she could feel his eyes on her. And the room grew tense as the few customers lowered their heads because they knew trouble often followed him. And she placed the cup in front of him, and he grabbed it and took a long sip, and then slammed it down on the counter so hard that liquid spilled, and he leaned close to her face, sneering that the coffee was cold, and asking if she even knew how to serve coffee, or if she was just there to smile and look pretty. And Kiara kept her voice calm as she said she was sorry and would bring him a fresh cup right away. But Mark laughed loud, and the sound made an old man in the corner flinch as Mark shouted that sorry did not fix cold coffee and that she needed to learn respect. And then he stood up, towering over her with his shadow falling across her, and jabbed his finger at her chest, saying that she thought she was strong working there and that she thought she was tough, but she was nothing. And Kiara's heart pounded as she looked into his eyes and saw cruelty, but remembered her father's words that strength is not in anger but in calm. And so she spoke firm, asking him to sit down because he was disturbing the customers. And his eyes narrowed as he barked, "Did you just tell me what to do because no waitress tells me what to do?" And then he grabbed her wrist tight, and the diner went silent, and the other customers froze because no one dared move. And Kiara felt fire rise inside her, and she had promised herself never to use her training unless she had no choice. But now, she had no choice, and she looked at his grip on her wrist and took a slow breath and told him to let go. But Mark only laughed louder, asking, "Or what will you do, little girl?" And that was the moment everything changed, because in one swift motion, she twisted, her arm free, and her other hand shot forward with speed faster than his eyes could follow. And she struck his chest with the heel of her palm with sharp, controlled power. And Mark's body lifted off his feet and crashed against the counter behind him as coffee cups rattled. And the diner gasped, and the bully groaned, clutch in his chest, unable to believe that a young waitress half his size had sent him flying with one strike dot, and Kiara stood tall with steady eyes and a calm voice saying, "I told you to let go." And Mark stumbled to his feet with pride, burning hotter than the pain in his chest, and his face turned red as he charged at her like a raging bull. But Kiara was ready and sidestepped quick, placing her foot against his leg dot, so he fell hard, to the floor and the crash. Shook the diner, and he looked up at her stunned because his muscles meant nothing, against her skill. And Kiara spoke again, telling him that violence would not make him strong, but respect would, and warning him to leave before he hurt himself more. And the old man in the corner whispered, "She saved us, and for the first time." The bully looked, unsure as he pushed himself up, breathing heavy, and spat on the floor, glaring at her and growling that this was not over, before storming out of the diner and slamming the door behind him. And the room was still until slowly the people began to clap, with eyes filled with awe and gratitude, and Kiara bowed her head slightly, saying, "Please, it is just my job." But inside, her heart beat fast, because she knew this was only the beginning. The next morning the sun rose over the city, and Kiara Faith walked slowly down the street with her work, shoes still stained from the long night, and her mind heavy with what had happened in the diner because she had never wanted to use her training in public dot. Yet the memory of Mark's twisted face and the fear in the eyes of the customers. We played in her thoughts again and again, and when she reached her small apartment above a laundromat, her mother was already awake, stirring a pot of soup on the stove, and her father sat by the window, reading a worn Bible. And her mother looked up at her and saw the look on her face and asked softly, "Child, what troubles you?" And Kiara sat down and told them about the bully and how he had grabbed her and how she had defended herself. And for a moment her father said nothing, and only studied her with eyes that were calm yet sharp, like the day he had first taught her to throw a punch. And finally he spoke and said, "My daughter, you did what was right because strength is not for hurting but for protecting, and you did not fight out of pride. You fought to keep peace." And Kiara's mother placed a hand on her cheek and said, "You carry both beauty and strength, and that is a heavy gift, but never let fear steal your peace." And Kiara nodded. But deep inside, she felt that this was not finished because the bully's last words had echoed like thunder. "This is not over." Later that day, the diner manager called her to the back office and closed the door. And he was a kind man with gray hair and tired eyes who had always treated Kiara like family. And he said, "Kiara, the people here love you, but trouble follows men. Like Mark, and I fear he may come back and bring worse with him. And I will understand if you want to take a break or even leave." But Kiara shook her head firm and steady and said, "Sir, I will not run from fear, and this place has been my home, and I will stand here no matter who comes." And the manager looked at her with pride. Though worry still lingered in his eyes that night, the diner was busier, and laughter filled the air. Yet Kiara's heart stayed alert because she felt like a storm was near. And she was right, because just as she poured coffee for a young couple, the door swung open again and Mark stepped inside. But this time he was not alone. For two men walked behind him, both tall and built with cruel grins on their faces. And the whole diner froze as the three men spread out like wolves, and Mark's voice boomed. "You thought you embarrassed me last night, little girl, but tonight I will show you what happens when you disrespect me." And one of his friends grabbed a chair and slammed it against the wall just to scare the people who sat trembling in silence. And Kiara set down the pot of coffee and faced them with calm eyes, though her heart pounded. And she said, "Mark, this is a place for peace and families, and if you care for your pride, then walk away now before you shame yourself again." But Mark only laughed as his friends chuckled behind him, and he shouted, "Do everyone see this girl? Think she's a fighter, but tonight she will learn she is weak." Then he rushed forward, swinging a heavy fist at her head. But Kiara ducked low and rose with a quick strike to his jaw that sent him stumbling back, and before his friends could react, she spun with speed and struck the first one in the stomach. So hard he fell, gasping for air. And when the second man lunged, she sidestepped and used his weight against him, flipping him to the floor with a crash that rattled the dishes. And the crowd gasped louder this time, some even standing to see clearer as 3 grown men, strong and heavy, lay in shock at the feet of a young waitress. And Kiara spoke firm, her voice steady as stone, saying, "I do not fight to hurt you. I fight to stop you, and this is your last chance. Leave this place and never return." Mark staggered up, his pride torn and his eyes wild with rage. But then his friends pulled at his arm, whispering, "We cannot win against her." And for the first time he looked at her with fear, hiding behind his anger. And then he spat once more, and stormed out with his men following close behind, and the diner filled with cheers. And some people even cried with relief. And Kiara stood still, her hands shaking only a little because she had kept control and not let hate rule her. And when the people clapped, she only bowed her head and said, "Please eat your food and enjoy your evening, because peace is stronger than fear." Later that night, when she walked home alone under the streetlights, she thought about how quickly peace could turn to chaos, and she remembered her father's lesson that a fighter is not one who loves to strike, but one who loves to protect. She felt both heavy and light because, though she had stood strong, she knew Mark was not finished and he would return in some darker way. And she whispered to herself, "Kiara, you must stay strong because the world needs light, even when darkness rises." The next days were quiet on the surface. Yet Kiara Faith felt the weight of hidden eyes on her everywhere she went, because the city had begun to whisper about the young waitress who dropped a bully with one strike. And people from different streets came to the diner just to see her, serve food, and smile. And some came hoping to see her fight again, though she wished for no fight and only for peace. But deep inside, she knew Mark was plotting, because a man like him would not let his pride rest. And her heart grew heavy each night. She walked home alone under the streetlights, but she never showed fear on her face. One evening, as the diner grew full with families and workers, a small boy ran in crying because his father had been cornered in the alley by Mark and his men. And Kiara felt fire rise in her chest as she dropped her tray and ran out the door with the boy leading her through the cold streets. And when she turned into the alley, she saw the truth because Mark and his 2 men were pressing the boy's father against the wall, demanding money and laughing at his fear. And Mark sneered when he saw her, saying, "So here comes the little waitress who thinks she is a warrior." And he shoved the man to the ground and stepped forward, flexing his fists. But Kiara lifted her hands calm and steady and said, "Mark, you shame yourself more each day. And if you want me, then leave the others and face me alone." And for a moment, silence hung heavy in the dark alley, until Mark barked out a laugh and waved his men back, saying, "Fine, I will face you, and tonight I will crush you." He swung fast, his fist cutting the air. But Kiara's body moved quicker as she ducked and struck his ribs with a sharp blow that made him grunt, and she followed with a kick to his leg that dropped into one knee, and the boy gasped with wide eyes as he watched the waitress fight like a storm, yet with calm grace. And Mark rose again with rage, rushing at her like a wild beast. But she sidestepped and struck his shoulders, spinning him off balance, and with one final move, she swept his legs. So he crashed hard onto the cold ground and lay there gasping with pain and disbelief. His men rushed forward but stopped when Kiara lifted her hand and said, "Enough, because your fight is not with me. It is with the hate inside you. And if you do not let it go, it will destroy." You and they froze, unable to move because something in her eyes held them still like stone. She turned to the boy's father, helping him up, and said, "Go home safe." And the boy ran to his father, holding tight with tears in his eyes, whispering, "Thank you, Miss Dot, thank you." Kiara looked back down at Mark, and for the first time, she did not see. Rage alone, but fear and shame twisted together. And she said softly, "Mark, you can keep chasing pride in pain, or you can change and find strength and respect." And she walked away, leaving him on the ground while the city lights glowed overhead. Word of the alley fight spread quick, and soon. The diner was filled with more people who whispered about the waitress with the strong hands and gentle heart, and some even called her a hero, though she never wanted fame. And when her father heard the story, he told her that real heroes never call themselves heroes, but stand firm when the world needs them. And Kiara felt tears in her eyes because she only wanted a quiet life. Yet fate kept calling her to stand tall. That night, as she closed the diner, a stranger walked in wearing a black coat and kind eyes, and he introduced himself as a retired police officer who had heard about her bravery. And he said, "Child, you are gifted, and the city needs people like you. Because bullies do not only break bones, they break spirits. And you have shown people that even the mighty can fall when truth stands firm." And Kiara thanked him humbly, but said, "I am only a waitress." And he smiled and said, "Sometimes the strongest warriors wear aprons instead of armor." When he left, she sat at the counter staring at the empty booze and thought about his words. And she realized that every person has a choice to use their gift for themselves or for others. And she whispered to herself, "I will use mine for others." Yet, even as she spoke those words, the door rattled in the wind, and she shivered because she knew the story with Mark was not finished, and darker days were still coming. The night was cool, and the city lights glimmered like tiny stars as Kiara. Faith walked home from the diner with her mind heavy because she could feel the story reaching its peak, and she knew. Mark would not let go of his anger until something greater than fists changed him, and that truth sat on her shoulders like a heavy stone. But she kept walking, steady her steps firm against the pavement. And when she reached her apartment, she found her father waiting by the door, his eyes calm yet searching, and he said, "My daughter, I dreamed of water rushing over fire. And I believe the storm is close and you must be ready." And Kiara hugged him tight, whispering, "I will not fail, Father." And that same night as the city slept, Mark sat alone in a bar, his hands shaking and his pride bleeding because he had lost again and again. To a young woman who stood half his size, yet carried more power than his muscles ever gave him, and the men around him told him to forget it and move on. But his heart burned like coal, and he swore he would crush her or be crushed. And so he planned one final strike. 2 nights later, the diner was packed with workers who had just finished their shifts and families who came to taste the warm pies that Kiara served with a smile. Yet beneath her smile, she felt a strange tension in the air like the calm before. A storm, and her heart beat heavy when the door burst open and Mark stepped in once more. But this time he was not alone because he dragged a chain in his hand. In his eyes looked dark with a madness deeper than before, and the people gasped as they shrank back into the booths, and Kiara stepped forward steady, though her body filled with fire, and she said, "Mark, stop this before it is too late." And he laughed bitter, saying, "Too late already, and tonight everyone will see you fall." Swung the chain through the air, and it cracked against the counter, splintering wood, and the sound echoed like thunder in the diner, and people screamed. But Kiara did not move because fear had no place in her heart. She only thought of protecting the lives around her. Mark charged, swinging again and again, but each strike missed as she dodged with grace and calm, her feet dancing across the floor. And with one swift motion, she caught the chain, wrapped it around her arm, and pulled him off balance, sending him crashing into a table and dishes shattered around him. But he rose again, wild as ever, and came at her with fists flying. Yet she blocked each blow and struck back with precision, until at last she caught him in a hold that pinned him to the floor, and the diner fell silent except for his heavy breaths and her steady voice as she said, "Mark, look at yourself, because all your rage has brought you nothing but shame and pain, and you could be more than this, if only you would let go of hate for the first time." Mark's eyes filled not with anger, but with tears that he fought to hide as his chest heaved and his voice cracked, asking, "Why do you not just finish me?" And Kiara's eyes softened, and she said, "Because strength is not to destroy, but to lift, and I will not destroy you. I will give you the choice to stand again as a better man." She released him and stepped back, and for a long moment the diner was still. As Mark sat broken on the floor, then slowly he rose, his face wet with sweat and tears, and he looked at her with shame and whispered, "I do not know who I am without anger her." And she answered, "You are whoever you choose to be, and tonight you can choose respect." The room remained hushed, until finally Mark dropped the chain to the floor with a loud clang and walked out of the diner. His steps heavy yet slower, calmer than before, and the people inside burst into applause, some with tears in their eyes, because they had witnessed not just a fight of fists, but a battle of the heart. And Kiara bowed her head, whispering, "Thank you, Father," because she knew her strength was more than strikes. It was mercy. Later that week, Mark returned not as a bully, but as a man seeking forgiveness, and he walked into the diner without rage. His hands open, his head low, and he asked for work. And the manager looked at Kiara, who nodded with a small smile. And so Mark was given a chance to wash dishes and sweep floors. And though many doubted him at first, he worked quietly each day. And in time, he found peace in the simple rhythm of honest work. The story of Kiara spread beyond the streets to nearby towns, and people spoke of the waitress who fought with her hands but healed with her heart, and some called her a warrior, while others called her an angel. But she only said, "I am Kiara Faith, the daughter of my parents and a servant of peace." Years later, the little diner on Maple Street was known as the place where light defeated. Darkness and people traveled just to sit where the story was born. And many asked Kiara to tell the tale, and each time she ended with the same word: "Strength without mercy is nothing but noise, but strength with love can change the world." And so her story lived not just in fists and strikes, but in the hearts of all who believed that even the weakest could rise and even the darkest soul could turn when shown the power of respect. Weeks passed after the storm inside the diner, and Kiara Faith thought life might return to quiet again. Yet the city was changing, because word of her story spread far beyond Maple Street, and people she had never met came just to see the young woman who defeated a bully and turned him into a worker of peace. And some came to eat pie, while others only wanted to see her smile or hear her soft voice. Yet Kiara never let pride take hold, for she remembered her father's warning that fame is a trap heavier than fear. And one night, as she wiped the counter clean, a woman entered the diner with tears in her eyes, holding the hand of her teenage daughter, and she said, "Are you Kiara Faith?" And Kiara nodded, and the woman cried harder, saying, "My daughter was bullied at school and she wanted to give up. But then she saw a video someone recorded of you standing strong and calm. And she said, 'If Kiara can face giants, then I can stand too.'" And Kiara knelt down, holding the girl's hand, and said, "You are strong because you choose respect over hate." And the girl smiled through tears and hugged her. And in that moment, Kiara knew her fight was no longer just inside the diner, but inside the hearts of many. Soon she began to see young boys and girls outside the diner practicing little moves with their arms, pretending to be like her. And she smiled, but also felt the weight, because she knew if they followed her, they must learn that strength is not for showing off, but for protecting. So one morning she spoke to her father, and said perhaps I should teach them Dot, and he placed his hand on hers and said a gift grows when it is shared. And that day Kiara gathered children in the park and showed them how to breathe steady and how to stand balanced, and she told them the first lesson is respect, the second lesson is calm, and the third lesson is mercy. And they listened with wide eyes, and joy filled her heart because she was passing on the light her father had given her Dot. But not everyone celebrated her, because there were still men in the city who thrived on fear, and one of them was a man named Victor who ran illegal fights in dark warehouses where men broke bones for money and crowds cheered for violence. And when he heard about Kiara, he grew angry because her story made people believe in honor instead of fear. And he feared losing power, so he sent his men to watch her and report. And soon they told him she was not only strong but loved by the people. And that love made her dangerous to his business. And Victor decided she must be tested. One late night when Kiara walked home from the diner, she heard footsteps behind her, and 3 strangers blocked her path. Their faces hidden under dark hoods, and one stepped forward saying, "Our boss wants to see if you are really as strong as they say." And he swung a bat at her head. But Kiara bent low, the bat slicing the air above her, and she struck his leg, sending him crashing down. And the other 2 lunged fast, but she moved with calm strikes, knocking one back with a palm to the chest and sending the others spinning with a sweep of her leg, and they groaned down the pavement, unable to rise. And she stood over them with eyes steady, saying, "Tell your boss that fear cannot rule where respect lives." And she walked away, leaving them in silence. Days later, Victor himself walked into the diner, tall with sharp eyes and a smile that hid poison. And he ordered a coffee and sat at the counter. And when Kiara poured it for him, he said soft, "I have heard much about you and your power, and I want you to fight in my ring because people would pay to see you, and I could make you rich and famous." And Kiara shook her head, saying, "Strength is not for sale, and I will never fight for money." And Victor leaned closer, whispering, "Then, you have made an enemy." And he stood and left, leaving the air heavy with threat. That night, Kiara sat with her parents and told them. And her father said, "Daughter, you must be careful because men like him are more dangerous than fists. They use fear to control." And her mother wept, saying, "I fear for you." But Kiara held their hands, saying, "I must stand because many look to me now, and if I run, then fear wins." Weeks passed with no sign of Victor, until one night a fire broke out near the diner, flames licking the sky, and people screamed as smoke filled the street, and Kiara ran into the heat, pulling children and elders from the blaze. And though her lungs burned, she did not stop until the fire trucks came. And when it was over, she saw Victor standing at the edge of the crowd, smirking, and she knew in her heart the fire was no accident. The police could do nothing for lack of proof. But Kiara knew he would keep pressing, and her father said, "Then you must fight him, not in his ring, but in his heart." And Kiara prayed for wisdom. Soon Victor made his boldest move, for he sent word across the city that Kiara Faith must face his champion in the warehouse ring, or he would bring chaos to Maple Street, and families trembled with fear and begged her not to go. But Kiara knew she must, because she could not let darkness scare the people into silence, and so she agreed. The night of the fight came, and the warehouse was packed with shouting crowds and flashing lights. And Victor stood proud as his champion entered, a giant man with scars and eyes like stone who towered over her, and the crowd roared as they looked down at her small frame in her simple clothes. But she stood calm. And when the bell rang, the giant rushed like thunder swinging, heavy blows that could shatter bones, yet each one missed as she moved like water flowing around stone. And she struck quick and sharp to his ribs, his arms, his legs, and the crowd gasped as the giant slowed, then stumbled. and with one final move, she spun and struck his chest, sending him to the floor where he lay unable to rise. Silence fell, and Kiara raised her voice, saying, "Strength without mercy is nothing but noise, and this fight is nothing but shame, and I will not be your pawn." Victor and she walked out, leaving the crowd stunned. That moment broke Victor's power, because the people saw her walk away without taking his money, and they began to turn from his ring, and within weeks his empire crumbled, and he fled the city. Kiara returned to the diner where the people cheered and cried with joy, and her father embraced her, saying, "You have done more than fight, you have freed hearts from fear." From that day, Kiara continued to teach children in the park and serve food in the diner with the same humble smile. And though challenges came, she faced them with calm strength. And the city slowly changed because one young woman chose mercy over hate and respect over fear. And her story lived on in the voices of families who told their children about Kiara Faith, the waitress who fought giants yet chose to heal with her heart. And every night before she slept, she whispered a prayer that the light of respect would keep shining long after her fists grew still.